Last year, right around Christmas, I was chatting with my friends over at Jensen USA, and kind of sort of for Christmas, I was asking for one of these Knolly Chilcotins. I ended up buying one directly from Knolly. Knolly was cool enough to extend a bit of a discount to me. Ironically enough, right now, all of you could buy one of these at an even lower, more discounted price than what I paid a year ago. So we'll talk about all that stuff later on in the video. But I've got almost a full year riding the Chilcotin here, so I figured this is a good time to do a more comprehensive review, breakdown, comparison, all of the things that we do here on the internet. So let's dive into it. And yes, it does still have the Velcro on it from the e-bike versus regular bike video from the end of summer. Since we last checked in about this bike, I hadn't really figured out a critical secret that's got it riding way better than the first few months I had it. So we'll go over that. I also have ridden, since we first chatted about this bike, some competitors, the Pivot Firebird and the Transition Spire. So in a little bit here, we'll break down the comparisons between Spire, the Chilcotin, the Firebird. So first up, let's get onto the trails back at the end of summertime when I'd first cracked the code for how to make this thing ride way better for my purposes. This Knolly frame is the same frame for two different travel configurations. One has 167 millimeters rear travel, the other has 151. As far as I can tell, I was riding the 151 mil travel version and back with that orange Fox 38 at 160 travel up front. I realized that the spare shock that Pivot sent would convert this bike to the full 167 rear travel, and this beautiful 170 Zeb would take care of the front end and would create a whole new experience for the same chassis. Today was my first ride on the newly reconfigured Knolly 167 with the 170 Zeb up front. I wish I would have done this earlier. Holy cow. I am enjoying this bike a lot more with this configuration. Right away, as we jumped into some trails here, I started to just feel more comfortable on this setup. Felt like I could get more air and pop higher with this new fork on the front. As your front end gets longer, it ever so slightly shortens the distance between your center of your bottom bracket and the center of the top of the head tube because the bike's been tilted back a little bit. Shorter reach bikes are usually easier to yank up into the air. As sometimes you do, I got kind of carried away with this new feeling of, ooh, giddiness, let's go high in the air. And I wanted to conquer an old log ride. And I was kind of nervous because it's kind of high up in the air, it's skinny, the log's ready to crack and break, so it's like shaking and old and dry rotted. After a dozen or so run-ups to it, I was feeling confident. I'm getting scared. So what do? You start taking pedals across this skinny log, 6 feet, 8 feet high in the air. And then I started to lean left because I knew I had to jump left, and I jumped like a bike length too early, which is kind of sketchy, but landed, had a little bit of a bounce, and was safe. And once you do something like that once, your confidence goes up if you don't die, and you think you can do it again. So went and attacked that log a second time, and Logan lined up an even cooler looking shot. And I actually stayed on the log almost longer than ideal. Having done it, I don't really want to go back and session it. It's a little bit dicey, but yeah, just having the right bike for that scenario, which I do now with the longer travel, it was a lot of fun. That was cool. There's been a feature here that I've wanted to do for a year or two, and embarrassingly enough, I haven't yet. I just wanted to wait for the right time. This was definitely the right bike for it. You kind of come down this hill, you take a pedal stroke, and then you jump off a little rock, you turn your bike in the air, you land sideways on this little rock ledge wall ride, and then if you do it right, you can pop off and catch a little backside. And with this much confidence on the bike, I thought, well, let's go ahead and do this. And sure enough, it worked. First try was a little bit unsmooth, but not bad. And then second try, caught perfect backside, lined it up ideal. That was definitely one for the bucket list right there. So today I had 2 bucket list items checked off. The way the bike's feeling right now is the best it has ever felt to date. The bigger fork absolutely changed how this bike feels, to the point that I'd say this is the bike that most benefited from a bigger fork out of all the bikes I've ridden over the years. And that's generally been my MO. Ride a bike, like it, put a bigger fork on it, like it a lot more. This one responded better to that. Before I forget, the water bottle compatibility of the Knolly is pretty good. I can fit a decent sized bottle in here. And inside these bottles, I've been running a little bit of Element electrolyte supplement. These are a real simple mix of potassium, sodium, magnesium, tiny bit of stevia extract for a little bit of sweetening, and they're super yummy. Wintertime mountain biking is kind of funny. You think it's going to be really cold and miserable, so you put on your best wintertime gear, and I've got some good stuff now. And then that protects you from the wind, the rain, the snow, but you end up sweating buckets. So I sweat just as much in the colder months with all my gear on as I do in the summer months with just regular summer gear. So I found that having a good electrolyte mix keeps these bottles way more effective. It keeps me thinking clearly, functioning way better when I'm riding, and I'm a big fan of the Element stuff. For a limited time, Element's running a special promotion through the link in my description below, where any purchase from the Element site earns you a free sample pack to try all the other flavors. This is a limited time offer, so take advantage of that link down below, and I want to give a big thanks to Element for their support. All right, let's get back into the discussion of the Knolly Chilcotin. It's been a busy summer with a lot of different mountain bikes, and the closest bike to this that I've been riding is the Pivot Firebird, and the two bikes are very different. I'm not sure I've got gnarly enough trails back home in the United States of America to really push the Knolly up to its limit. So we cruised up north across the border and tried some more aggressive trails, and more aggressive they certainly were. Today we shot a tutorial video on how to ride steep trails. The Knolly was a great bike for that sort of environment. You'll notice I still have that RockShox Zeb fork on here, the 170 fork, and I still have the long travel rear shock setup. I really prefer the Chilcotin in this longer travel 167 configuration. So on the steeper bits of trail, this is enough suspension that you can make some decisions on the fly and kind of pound your way through obstacles and you'll be okay. It's not like a huge lengthy wheelbase race bike by any means. It's actually more on the Nimble side. I don't know how the geometry looks. I haven't studied this geo chart in a few weeks, so it's not front of the brain. But in the tighter, steeper switchbacks, I can get through them pretty darn well in the Chilcotin, but I have to be very conscious of letting go the front brake, which happens for any bike, and then I can lean and carve it right on through, and it feels very intuitive for those situations. The back end's a good neutral length, and the front end's like pretty solid. I will say in one of the bumpier, rockier sections, charging, pounding through, the bike's not as plush as like even a Ripmo per se. I know this has a ton of travel, but it's so firm at the end of the stroke that it kind of rides like a shorter travel bike until you have a bigger hit, sort of. Speaking of bigger hits, I only sort of bottomed this bike out. We found like a 12-foot drop, and the landing wasn't super steep. I thought I probably could land both wheels together, but that would gain so much speed. I wasn't sure if I would then bounce or anything like that. So I actually sent it and landing geared it rear wheel first. My back's a little bit sore. I might have bottomed out on that bigger hit, but the suspension's like, it ramps up a ton at the very end of the stroke. So while it's advertised as this almost 170 rear travel bike, you're only using, I don't know exactly if you're using 145, 150. So you get deeper into the stroke, unlike the Ibis Ripmo, more often, even with lots of volume reducers, than you do on this. When it is time to jump, because this bike does have that really aggressive progression ratio on the longer travel configuration, pretty natural and intuitive, and the harder you push on it into takeoffs, it can support that, and it can give you plenty of pop or boost or whatever to clear some distances. We tried a pretty janky jump over the trail setup thing, and that was right in this bike's wheelhouse. That was super fun. Even that bigger drop today was like, it didn't feel irresponsible going for it on this bike. A lot of the times it's important to look at the regionality of a bike. So, you know, if you live in Arizona, a Pivot might make a lot of sense because they're designing their trails for their local area. Up here in BC, it's steep and it's tight. Rarely are you really going full throttle. Maybe further to the interior in the Okanagan, sure, you might be, but out here, a bike like this in the tighter, closer to Vancouver metro area makes a lot of sense because there are a lot of big free-riding features and steep things where you need that travel. But then because the trees are so narrow, you need a bike that can still maneuver its way through all that. And I think the Chilcotin does a pretty good job of checking all those boxes. It's still a heavy bike, and pedaling it up the hill, you notice the weight. There's times where I wouldn't mind it being plusher, and there's times where I appreciate how much it ramps up. I'm gonna play around a little more with the shock configuration, maybe see if I can remove some volume reducers. I'll try the slacker setting as well. From what I remember, the slacker setup messed with the suspension a ton and had it kind of feel a little bit bindy and nowhere near as smooth as the steeper geometry position. So I'll play with that a bit more, and I think it's time we head back across the border and get some dinner. We're getting late here. According to the iPhone, I've been waiting in line about 33 minutes now. First run of the day. Let's try this bike park thing. I don't know what I'm doing here. So I did take this bike up to the Whistler Bike Park for a closing weekend up there. I have not ridden Whistler Bike Park in a long time. I used to spend a lot of time at the bike park. So I've ridden the bike park a lot more on downhill bikes. Comparing this experience to an older downhill bike, the Chilcotin is really good when trails are steep and tight and you need that slack angle and sufficient wheelbase so you don't go over the handlebars. But it's not a super long bike. It's not really built to be shredded at absolute top speed all the time. Way more fun than the 8-line trail. Bike park trails are pretty fast, so Chilcotin could do it. But if I was riding more than a bike park day or two a year, I'd probably go for a little bit bigger, longer wheelbase bike. And yes, it did get better with the bigger fork up front, but it's still not as big as something like that Transition Spire. Before we start comparing this Chilcotin to the other bikes, I do want to mention this new context we're in. So at the moment, Jensen has these things discounted like 35% below retail pricing. And they only have 7 of them left. So if you act pretty quickly, you could probably grab one of these. And given that like $1,800 for a frame pricing, it totally changes the context of everything I'm gonna say for the next few minutes here. So I'll link to that in the description down below. It is an affiliate link, so if you buy anything from Jensen, I'll earn a slight commission. That's a huge part of how we make all these videos happen. But I'm stoked that they're doing that sale because that totally changes the conversation for what this bike is. So first up, let's compare the Knolly Chilcotin to the Transition Spire. I have a Spire sitting right there and I can't wait to go ride it again next week. So the Spire is a pretty aggressive bike with a pretty long back end, a surprisingly short reach, but it's so slack that it gets a super long wheelbase. It also has 3 millimeters more travel than the Chilcotin. But the feel of the two bikes on the trail, it's super different. So the Chilcotin's reach is a touch longer than the Spire. Typically longer reach, you'll lose a little bit of playfulness. The Spire's pretty darn nimble on the trail, way more than you'd think looking at the geometry. A lot of that is because of the shorter reach. The Chilcotin has a slightly longer reach, but it actually ends up being even easier to handle in the tighter, more technical sections of trail. I feel like a lot of that comes from a slightly shorter rear end feel. The Chilcotin feels totally at home on the real steep, tighter stuff. I noticed far fewer caught pedals with this bottom bracket height than on the Spire. I think that comes from a little bit shorter wheelbase. If you have a shorter wheelbase, your breakover angle is a bit more relaxed. There is a substantial weight difference between the Spire and the Chilcotin. So the Spire, it's definitely lighter. Chilcotin rides like it's heavier, but then the suspension plays into that feel. So while the Spire is lighter, it also has a more active suspension where you can get deeper into the travel more easily. The Chilcotin ramps up so much, so quickly, that it feels like a way shorter travel bike, and it's also quite a bit heavier. So you've got to do more to keep things smooth. Whereas on the Spire, not only is it slacker, you can just kind of point and shoot a bit more than the Chilcotin. I had more fun on the Chilcotin when things were tight and technical, maybe not quite as steep. I had more fun on the Spire when things were faster and more wide open. And if I really wanted absolute confidence in something, I felt like I could send it deep on the Spire. One thing that's kind of not cool to say in this day and age is that I prefer the Chilcotin's slacker seat angle over the Spire. When you're seated on the Chilcotin, it handles way more neutrally than the Spire. And I felt like I got hung up on less stuff, on technical flat and uphill bits. Because of that slacker seat tube angle, my weight was a little bit lower to the ground. And then with extra pedal clearance, it worked out great in the technical stuff, a little bit more intuitive than the bigger Spire.
Hi, Jeff.
I don't think anyone's really comparing a Pivot Firebird to a Knolly Chilcotin. Chilcotin's kind of like almost free-ride-y, kind of enduro-y, but not so racy. Firebird's like cut and dry enduro race bike. I think their website says racing, racing, racing all over it. Very different bikes, but they both have about 170 travel. I think this has 2 millimeters more than the Firebird. Does anyone count that? No, it's the same. The Firebird is a great bike. Suspension was pretty firm at first when you're pedaling. There might be a touch more small bump compliance at lower speeds on the Chilcotin. But there is a big difference. Once you start moving medium trail speed and faster and the shock starts getting past that, about 40–45% of travel, a little bit past sag, the Firebird has a more open feel that far into the travel. It's a little bit more linear, so it feels like it has quite a bit more travel, even though it actually has a little bit less. The Firebird is also way, way, way lighter than the Chilcotin, so it was easier for me to get it off the ground. It's like a 4 or 5 pound weight difference between these two complete bikes, the Chilcotin versus the Firebird. So I noticed that more than I'd like to admit, but that's okay. As for the geometry, I did really like the Chilcotin's geometry as an all-around trail bike. For true racing, kind of a toss-up. I think aspects of the Spire and the Firebird and the Chilcotin could all come together to make a great race bike. Individually, Firebird, I'd rather race it than the Chilcotin. It does feel a little bit more stout at speed. I don't know on paper if the wheelbase is indeed longer or not. The shorter back end on the Firebird has a very different feel than this slightly longer one. Ironically, none of these bikes are super easy for me to wheelie. The Spire's got like a 446 chainstay. It's a bit harder to pull up. Then it's probably the easiest bike to hold in a wheelie once you get it up. The Chilcotin's got a bit more neutral geometry, but with the shock a bit more forward, I had to pay more attention when I was manualing it. Just like the layout of things, it took more effort for me to sustain a manual on this. None of the bikes are exactly manual machines per se. I do think my Ripmo has the edge with manuals. I was able to better predict on the trail what the Firebird would do. Just in terms of its slightly stiffer layup, lighter weight handling, and it's closer to the race bikes I usually end up riding. But if I could have Chilcotin geometry with Firebird weight and Spire suspension, that would be an amazing all-around setup. So backing this up, I know the Ibis Ripmo AF is not a bike you're expecting to compare the Chilcotin to. This is 167, 170. The Ripmo AF is like 145, 160, so a bit smaller in travel. But yeah, the AF is like a pound and a half lighter in terms of the frame, which I definitely noticed. And for like a couple $100 more than the original price of this frame, you could get a complete Ripmo AF. And just thinking the experience on both bikes is good. I really like that AF as an all-around bike. The Knolly's got the edge when it gets steep and gnarly, like in actual British Columbia riding. This does have the edge and the really steep stuff, but for an all-around trail bike, you can go to more places and have a good time on the Ripmo AF. But if you do need a very capable bike, now that these things are on sale so much, it does get away with more in the steep and deep than does the Ibis. Stiffness-wise, it's surprisingly similar. Weight-wise, it's quite a bit more. I wish I had Ripmo AF weight here, but I don't. And, that's just different feel for different people. It's worth mentioning that once you're past the standard 32 to 34 pound enduro bike weight, once you're way north of that, each pound of weight becomes very noticeable. And my Ripmo AF's right around 34, 35 pounds, which is acceptable and it's fine. This guy feels quite a bit heavier. Between my downhill casing rear tire, the Super Boost wheels end up a touch heavier. I don't know what it is, just the overall build was somewhere around 38 pounds, which is heavier than a lot of downhill bikes these days. I tend to send it, not the biggest of anybody, but I tend to send it relatively hard, and I was not having any issues with bottoming this bike out at all. So I almost feel like it's more progressive than many people would really need. So at the end of the day, I had a fun time checking out the Knolly, my first time riding a Knolly bike. And thank you all for suggesting this bike and requesting it. Let me know in the comments down below, why do you love the Knolly brand so much? All right, guys, thank you for joining me. Take advantage of that closeout sale if you're looking for a great bike at an amazing price. And if you have any questions for me, drop them in the comments down below. Thank you all so much. I'll see you in the comments. Peace.